Well, today I want to talk about defense. I think defense is one of the topics that gets the most debated in theoretical arguments between anarcho-capitalism and having a government, and I think that's kind of interesting. Most of the other things that we debate about um, do get debated about in the rest of society. So, like, we can have a debate about free market healthcare, um, but even in regular society, people debate healthcare, although not necessarily in the same terms that we would in an anarcho-capitalist versus or a libertarian versus a statist paradigm. And most of the things that we do have discussions about, that we do kind of um, analyze, uh, are debated within the rest of society, but defense is something that in a lot of ways isn't. I mean, at a very superficial level, obviously there are people who disagree with what the government is doing um, in this or that way, but very few people in the rest of society are debating whether or not states should handle defense. It's taken for granted, and it's a big topic, and I can understand why it's so hotly debated. And I've made videos about it in the past. Um, but without covering all of it right now, which I certainly can't do, there's issues about public goods, about free riders. Um, there's a lot of historical information. There's a lot of things about systems, about what works and what doesn't work. Maybe some things, some systems work better for offense, and some systems work better for defense. And some systems may work in one context and not in another. And these are all worthwhile things to explore, but I'm not going to explore them all in this video. I haven't even explored them all, as far as they can be in just in my life, let alone in a presentation like this. But there's a couple elements of the debate that I find really frustrating. For one, um, people, and this is not just for defense; it's for lots of things. But in the social sciences, when we're dealing with human society, there's so many variables and circumstances in play that it is, I would say, probably empirically impossible to prove, at least within a certainty, or even with a calculatable likelihood, whether or not the cause of an outcome can be pinpointed on a particular cause. So if we look at a war, you have two sides fighting each other, or maybe more than two sides, and one side prevails over the other. Um, and sometimes that can actually be debatable, what counts as prevailing. Solzhenitsyn, and he's not the only one to observe this, said, in World War II, it's debatable to say that the USSR was victorious. Now, politically, apparently they were. They conquered a lot of territory. They defeated their enemies, but tens of millions of Soviets died in the course of that. More Soviets died in the course of that victory than any other country ever faced in defeat, probably. Maybe a few exceptions in Chinese history. Um, and I think that's an actual debatable thing. And I'm not coming down on either side of it just to say it's not always that simple. But let's say we can say that one side wins. It's very hard to go and say, well, it won because of its political organization, or because of its leader, or because of its geography, or its technology, or the generalship of this or that person, or the organization of its military, or anything, because there's so many variables in play in an outcome like that. There are so many different variables. The number of variables that differ between states or between societies, and actually even between individuals, there's more variables than we can actually tabulate. We could never come up with a list, or we can't now anymore. Maybe at some point this will be possible. It is not now. No analysis that's ever been made up to this point will incorporate this. To actually list all the variables that differ between societies, between people, between systems, let alone quantifying those differences and attaching statistical probabilities or qualitative and or quantitative comparisons between them, to the point where we can say, well, uh, Germany lost World War II because it wasn't a democracy, or uh, you know, uh, the American Revolution was victorious because they were fighting on their home territory. It's I would say probably impossible to say for certain. Obviously, these variables all matter. Um, some of them matter a great deal. England being an island has apparently been something that's been a significant factor in military outcomes for a long time, but not always a decisive one. So it's very hard then to have a debate on this and then point to examples and be like, ah, see, this proves or this doesn't prove our point. Um, we have, it's difficult when you compare a stateless society with a state society because stateless societies and state societies both differ in so many ways. Um, Sometimes it's difficult to define a state, and depending how you define it, how many and which societies count as stateless is very hard. I think that have been a large number of societies, especially the farther back you go in time, that were indeed stateless, or at least stateless by the standards that we have today. And they have a mixed record in terms of their martial prowess. Some of them were successfully able to defend themselves, and some of them were not. Some of them were able to successfully expand, and some of them were not. And it's very hard to say that the reason that they were or were not able to do any of those things is because they were or were not statist. Um, the repeated conquest of the Chinese by the Mongolians, who many times did not have what we would consider a state, is one example. On the contrary, when the Chinese finally did incorporate, basically Mongolia into the Qing Empire, would it be easy to just say, well, the reason the Chinese were able to do this is because they have an emperor, because they have a bureaucracy, because they have a state, and the Mongols are disorganized. It's very hard to actually say that the Chinese had a state for a long time. It might just be that the Chinese are vastly more populous and vastly more technologically advanced, um, vastly more educated, vastly more any number of other things. Um, and it's very hard to pin that on which one is the cause, if there is indeed even a singular cause. Likewise, for all the years that the Mongols resisted the Chinese, well, is that because they have a decentralized organization, or is that because they have a martial culture, or is that because they live on the steppe and it's very hard for states, especially in pre-modern times, to project their power into steppe conditions? States up until modern times really did have a very strongly agricultural basis and had a difficult time perpetuating or extending their power outside of agricultural areas into really mountainous areas, into desert areas. I guess with the sole exception is through maritime power they're able to do this. But uh, even in the United States, the U.S. government had a difficult time projecting its power into the Great Plains, relative to how easily it was to spread through the more agriculturally um, viable areas in the Midwest. So I think that it's good to look at history, and it's good to look at examples, and it's good to look at empiricism, but it's also good to realize the limits of what that can tell you. But right now, the debate is so biased and with conservative bias to the idea that people are the people who maintain the state position have a very strong bias in favor of the state to the point where they can't even conceive that other options even work. That nothing can, like, that if you don't have a state, that you are helpless. And not only that, it's usually if you don't have a state like the one that they advocate, or that usually is the one that they grew up in, right? you know, Russians, Soviets, would say if you don't have a dictator like Stalin or a czar like Ivan the Terrible, you're helpless and you can't defend yourself. You're completely at the mercy of your neighbors. Whereas, an American would not say that you need a Stalin or an Ivan the Terrible. And obviously, the two societies have different histories and different geographies, but it is very likely when you hear someone from a society advocating what their society basically already has and saying this is the only way, that they are heavily biased, um, and reaching conclusions that are potentially not warranted. And I think that it's good to look at history, even if you can't find provable test cases, because there are no laboratory experiments. You can at least demonstrate that, hey, other systems can work, and can be effective. And you can see this all over history. We can see this, for instance, in the Americas. If we were to take some of the arguments in favor of states in terms of their defensive abilities, and you say, well, you have more centralized power, you can coerce free riders, um, you can um, generate defense as a public good, and you can enforce taxation to pay for it, and you can coerce people into the military and into the logistically supporting the military, and you can field larger armies, and then you can have centralized control, which means you can maximize your effectiveness. And so if we were to say look at the Western Hemisphere in 1492, and we were to look at the societies that existed then, there was an enormous variation between very centralized, very powerful, very state-like, and if we look at like Franz Oppenheimer, he would not have defined most of the organizations in the New World as the states. I think by many other definitions you would, but you certainly have more centralization, more overt military organization in places like Mesoamerica and South America. The two that are most well known and probably the best examples would be like the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. On the other hand, in North America, you do have some more state-like organizations, especially in the southeast and in the Ohio River and the Mississippi River River Valley. But then you have large areas that are not necessarily nomadic or semi-nomadic, very decentralized, don't have very strong political systems. And this varied. I'm not generalizing this everywhere, but there were many places that lack this. And if we were to look at the map, you would say, well, clearly these Mesoamerican uh, societies with their vast militaries and their leaders and their martial prowess and their actually overtly militaristic cultures, they would be much better suited to defending themselves against an invasion by anyone. They would do better against an aggressive invasion than a less organized society would do. And when that invasion happened, when the Spaniards arrived, um, we find that essentially almost completely the opposite of that occurred. Um, the Mexican state, the Aztec state, was defeated in something like less than 2 years, something like 19 months of combat, which involved less than, I think it was 500 to 600 conquistadors. Also, by the way, not funded by the government. They were actually there completely privately funded against the wishes of the government officials in Cuba, from which most of them came. Um, so an interesting example of a non-state institution spreading a conquest. Um, and they were overrun in that amount of time. And very quickly, Mexico was incorporated as a new part of New Spain. But Cortez himself, after consolidating power in Mexico, invaded Guatemala with far more Spaniards and a huge coterie of native levies, and returned, a few months later, a year or so later, in total defeat, just barely surviving the ordeal. Even though the societies that he was encountering in Guatemala were not centralized, we did not have states, we're not as populous, we're not as martial. And again, how many variables are at play there? Quite a few, and so I can't say that the reason one and not the reason the other. That could be a reason. My guess is it's part of the reason, but not the whole reason. And you can see that, societies in North America, even though they're fighting even more technologically advanced English military forces, colonial forces, 100, 200 years later, did much better, even though many of them were much less centralized. Uh, in some of the history books that I've read about the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region, um, it was made explicit, and this is by a completely non-libertarian author, that the more centralized, more governed societies like the Illinois tribe, I'll say tribe, the Illinois tribe, um, succumbed much quicker than more decentralized organizations like the Ojibwe or the Chippewa. Um, which again is not to say that's the reason, but the prediction that you would make if you were to assume that status arguments are correct, or at least always correct, is the complete opposite of what actually happened. Now, I think that's a really interesting example. The entire New World kind of provides examples like that. There are others. Another good one is the Norman conquest of England. If you look at the British Isles in 1066, the richest, most powerful part by far is England. They have the most population, they have the most military forces, they have the most tax revenue at their disposal, and they have a state that is, um, people can overestimate how decentralized it was up to that point. Um, under Newt and under the Confessor, the English state was becoming progressively more state-like, more centralized, um, and it was certainly more centralized, more powerful than, say, Wales or Scotland was. And yet, when the Normans invaded, they conquered England very quickly, and uh, Wales took 300 to 400 more years of violence before it was conquered. And one of the authors that I read, even though again not a libertarian, not coming at this from the perspective of trying to juxtapose two competing political systems or rationalize how they do or don't work, said, well, in Wales, there could be no Hastings. There was no central political unit in Wales. There was nobody to defeat in a battle and then make them sign a treaty and have all of the state succumb to you, which is what happened in Mexico, for instance, or in with the Inca later with Pizarro in Peru. Uh, you could go in Wales and you could maybe conquer one village, but the people in the next village would not give two shits about the fact that you'd done that, and you'd have to resume the conquest anew. And without the ideology of submission already there, the people that you might militarily defeat once are very likely to rise again or support risings that happen later. Again, this isn't to say it always works this way and that it's not the only factor. Wales had lots of rivers and they don't seem like mountains today, but at the time, like very difficult logistically difficult to traverse mountains. But this is also one of the factors. Well, a more modern example that I think was interesting that I've long been curious about is Switzerland. Now, I'm not going to make this video to like lionize the Swiss or say that the Swiss system is perfect or that I like everything about the Swiss. And the Swiss is certainly not a stateless system. This isn't an attempt to conflate the cantons of Helvetica with anarcho-capitalism or Ancapistan. It's not that. But what it is, it's a very different system. It's a true federal system. The United States says we have a federal government. We have a central state that is constructed in a way that appears like a federal system, but it does not work that way in function, and it never really has. Um, the Swiss have an actual federal system. They don't have a president who's in charge of everything. They don't have a centralized military. They don't have a centralized command structure. Um, and yet they've been able to defend themselves very effectively for 600, 700 years. Almost with the sole exception of the Napoleonic invasions, with complete success. And the most recent example of this is World War II. And as it just so happens, I read a book about Switzerland in World War II. Target Switzerland, Swiss Armed Neutrality in World War II. And this is by Stephen Halbrecht. Some of you may remember Stephen Halbrecht wrote the book on gun control in the Third Reich. He's written a number of books on the Second Amendment. He's an interesting guy. I've met him at Students for Liberty twice now. If I've seen articles that he wrote a long time ago where he almost is coming across as like a radical left anarchist. But when you see him today and when you hear him speak today, he's very straight-laced. He wears a suit, and he almost sounds like, an independent institutes or American Enterprise Institute or NRA guy. Like he seems very straight-laced and kind of right-wing, but there's a definite radical strain to his stuff. And this book was published maybe about 10 years ago, and it goes through the history of Switzerland, a little bit when it was founded, their emphasis on martial ability, and with the advent of firearms, their emphasis on the personal training of people in firearms use, something that continues to this day. Swiss, I think there are two Western societies that have gun cultures, the United States and Switzerland. They're not identical gun cultures. There are important differences between the two, but firearms and personal firearms ownership and use within different contexts. The Swiss don't allow things that the Americans do. The Swiss tend to have a dim view about just like carrying a gun openly or concealed around for self-defense. It's much more tied in with defense of society or the state or the canton than it necessarily is in the United States. In the United States, we do have a central military, and so they aren't the same, but guns are very popular. They're very widely used. Their knowledge of firearms training and marksmanship are widely diffused within each society. Guns per capita, they're the only two states that are even close to each other. The United States is approaching a 1-to-1. I usually hear 8 to 10 kind of thing. Switzerland is like about one gun for every two people, which is like the second or third highest. Usually, it's hard to estimate that sort of thing. But so what's interesting about this example is that the Swiss don't have a centralized state. They don't have a general staff. They don't have a military dictatorship. They don't have a military leader. They don't have a political leader for that matter. They're also a very heterogeneous society. You have majority who are German speakers. You have the Italian speakers. You have French speakers. You have the Romanish, a very tiny, like it's just a few villages. Um, so you have this pluralistic, divided society in a lot of ways. It's surrounded by a host of centralized states. Some of them are monarchies. Some of them are republics. Some of them become fascist dictatorships, all that have enormous military budgets, large standing armies, much larger than Switzerland. I think Switzerland at the time of World War II had a population of around 5 million. You know, you compare that to, say, Germany, which I think was 60 or 70 million at the time, France, which would have been 50 or 60 million. Um, you know, Italy, I'm not sure, probably in the 20s or 30s. Um, and you have the Wehrmacht, the German military, led by the very aggressive and dynamic leadership of Adolf Hitler, launching a series of campaigns against all of his surrounding states. For he absorbs Austria uh, in a bloodless coup, and then Czechoslovakia, and then launches wars into Poland, and then Denmark and Norway, Belgium, Holland, France, the fall of France, then later, a few months later, into Yugoslavia, into Greece, and basically has tremendous military success in all of these events and wipes the floor clean. Now, Switzerland was a particular target of within the Nazi ideology and within the animus of Hitler himself. Most of the people in Switzerland are ethnic Germans and they speak German. And maps published in the Third Reich would depict at least the German areas of Switzerland as part of Großdeutschland. This is an area that is belongs to Germany in terms of Nazi thinking as much as any part of Austria or Bavaria, or the Memel districts or Danzig or anywhere else. Also, the liberal political system of Switzerland was something that was anathema to the Nazis. They hated the pluralism, sorry, um, the free press, the multiculturalism to the extent that you could say that it had that, which it did. Its toleration of Jews, which were legally not distinguished from regular Swiss citizens. They were given guns, which would have been something that the Nazis would not like. Um, and the Nazi press and Hitler in particular, many times, not just Hitler, Goebbels, all of them lambasted Switzerland constantly. The rhetoric, Nazi rhetoric against Switzerland was so intense. One of the things I learned from this book, that as soon as Hitler became the chancellor, within a month or two, the Swiss mined all bridges and tunnels that bordered Switzerland with Germany, all of them. And they remained mined and rigged for explosion from that point until the end of World War II. And there were several points during that time when the cables rigging the explosions, rigging up the explosives, were cut. Um, Now, eventually, the Swiss had all these positions guarded 24/7. So, needless to say, they were very worried at the potential of German aggression. Um, During the war, as successively all the other states succumbed to the Nazi onslaught, um, plucky little Switzerland became very concerned that they would be invaded directly or ancillarily as part of wider military campaigns, especially at 2 points in the war during the invasion of France. The Maginot Line, which is a good example of a state, a centralized political system investing a lot of resources into something that ended up not working. Um, it had a good reputation, and the German planners were thinking it would be best to bypass the Maginot Line either by going to the south through Switzerland or to the north through Belgium and Holland. Um, Ultimately, and he talks about this in the books, German planners um, decided that going through Switzerland would be much, much more difficult than going through the Low Countries, and so that's what they ended up doing. Um, and defeating France in 6 weeks. Uh, Later in the war, when the Allies invaded Italy in 1943, and there was a coup in the Italian government, which basically left the Axis at that point, um, there became this great fear that the German forces in Italy would become cut off from the Third Reich. Uh, and the best way to secure that would be through the conquest of Switzerland. So there was a period in 1943 where it was there was high concern that the Germans would invade them. And then later in the war, many German writers had talked about conquering Switzerland and building a final redoubt of National Socialism in the mountains of Bavaria, Austria, and Switzerland, that they could kind of continue a guerrilla war as long as possible. Um, but the Swiss made it very clear that they were that they practiced armed neutrality and that they would fight to the death. That their population, though small, had could mobilize far more people for military service than any other state because military training was so common. Since it was a martial society, since so many Swiss were trained and practiced in gun ownership and marksmanship and fighting, that they would make the Germans pay very dearly if they were to invade. Um, that the basic plan was to destroy all the bridges and basically act as a speed bump and then retreat into the so-called Redoubt National, basically the Alps. Um, which were ringed with artillery and machine gun nests, and basically designed that any attacking forces up the valleys would be in a kill zone the entire time. They'd be basically attacking up a gun range that's enclosed on either side by steep alpine slopes, by highly trained marksmen who would be defending their homelands in prepared positions. Um, During the course of the war, the German made many plans about what it would require to invade Switzerland, um, and they varied, of course, in their estimates of how many it would take. But in some of the estimates, um, they were saying somewhere in the orders of it would take 20 to 1 German soldiers to Swiss soldiers to basically conquer the country. Not the plains that were nearest to Germany, but to the entire country all the way up through the Alps. And that's interesting because the mobilization of the Swiss military at its maximum, and it stayed that way through most of the war, was between 700,000 and 800,000 men. Well, 20 times that number, I mean, that's vastly more than the Germans ever had, let alone that they ever used. That's larger than the invasion force of the Soviet Union. Now, that's an estimate that some planners in the Wehrmacht had. That's not to say it actually would have taken that many, but this was very clear. If you attack, we are going to fight to the death. Another thing is, since there was no central authority in Switzerland, nobody could surrender on behalf of the whole country. This is in marked contrast to, say, France, where the government could just say, okay, all you millions of undefeated Frenchmen who haven't been defeated yet, you just give up now. And this actually happened in the Franco-Prussian War as well. The Prussian military was logistically in a very bad position, almost in disastrous circumstances, even though the French military had basically been defeated. But the French government in Paris, after several months of siege, surrendered, and all of France gave up at that point, even though there were millions of able-bodied Frenchmen willing to and capable of still resisting. And the logistics alone of maintaining the Prussian army at field strength at that time was causing severe strains in the Prussian state, to the point where people like Bismarck, who was someone who was in a position to know, feared that in a few more weeks or less even, that the war would have to be concluded on terms less than actual surrender. Now, this is simply impossible in Switzerland. The Swiss were told that no one can surrender for you. If you hear an order to surrender, you should ignore it as enemy lies or somebody who is, exceeding their authority, because nobody has the authority to do that in Switzerland. Um, uh, the martial spirit was such that within military units, there were several secret societies that were developed that had the explicit purpose of killing any of their superiors who were thought to maybe be favoring surrendering to the Germans. So it was a society that was dedicated to fighting to the death on the realization that if that could be understood by your enemies, the chances that they attack would be diminished. Now, again, is the political disorganization of Switzerland the only variable? No. Is the fact that their population was per capita much better trained and much more acquainted with arms than other European states, is that the only difference? No. Obviously, there are geographical ones, the big one being the Alps. But in the course of the war, the Germans invaded other countries that were very mountainous, that had great natural defenses. Norway comes to mind. Not only is it very mountainous and very cold, it's also across the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, from Germany. And yet, they were not able to mount nearly as an effective resistance, although they did resist. The other good example being Yugoslavia and Greece, both countries being mountainous, having very rough terrain, having people who were willing to defend themselves, and yet they fell apart very quickly. Um, in fact, in the matter, I think Yugoslavia lasted about a week, and Greece not much longer than that. Um, Switzerland was not attacked, even though it's right there in the middle. It has lots of valuable industry. It has, hundreds of thousands of men that hypothetically could be drafted into the Wehrmacht, something that they definitely needed, especially as the war progressed. But it was very clear that many thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Germans could potentially have died in a war rooting out the Swiss. This was also made it very clear that they would destroy the most strategically valuable assets in their country, which were the tunnels through the Alps to Italy. These tunnels had very there was a lot of international agreements governing the use of these tunnels. During the war, the Germans could send supplies through them, like coal or commercial goods. They could not send troops or military hardware through them. But the Swiss made it very clear that within minutes of Germany attacking Switzerland, not only would all bridges and access points to Germany be destroyed, all the tunnels through the Alps would also be destroyed, and destroyed in a way that they would not be able to be rebuilt for several years. The tunnels took several years to build. Who knows how long it would have taken the Germans to rebuild them, assuming they could ever have even gotten that far. The Swiss were fairly confident that they could hold the Redoubt Nationale for a very long time. They stockpiled munitions there, they stockpiled fuel there, they stockpiled food there, um, and they basically let it be known that this is their goal will be to exact the highest possible price, and that's the beginning and the end of their defensive strategy. And whatever you want to say, um, it's the one country the Germans never attacked, even though they were on a really good winning streak for a long time, and they had strong reasons to do so. They had strong reasons to attack, besides the personal dislike of the Swiss. Um, and I think it is a testament to the effectiveness of this strategy. Now, this is again not to conflate and say that Switzerland is an anarcho-capitalist paradise or that it's a totally free market society. The point of this is to say that it is a different society that is organized differently, that is not as centralized, that it shows things that like having more martial spirit and martial ability um, diffused within the society makes a difference. It's not always decisive. It can't always guarantee that you can't possibly be attacked or defeated, but it gives you options that would not be there otherwise. And to show that, to just assume that, well, you have to have a system like the United States or like Germany, you have to have a dictator, you have to have a central army, is false. That you don't have to have those things, that there are other ways. Now, which one's optimal, which one works the best, that's a much more difficult question. I don't think I think when people try and frame debates like this, like, well, which one works and which one doesn't work, I think the only honest answer is that both any system, because it's not just like there's two, there's a gradation that goes all the way in more than one dimension, to be honest. Um, Everything is probably functional by some rubric. And when people say the government works, I always like what exactly do you mean by it works? Like it exists? Like I'm not dead? We have people alive in the United States today that are eating and are able to make YouTube videos. Does that therefore mean that it works? I, if you define it as by some Benthamite method, well, however you define it, and I think there's lots of ways you could define it, and depending on how you define it, you would get different answers, which makes these debates really kind of uh, require a lot of definitions and exposition and explanation before you can really get anywhere. But any system that you can propose by whatever rubric you define working will work in some manner, in some degree. A monarchy is capable of doing some things. A democracy is capable of doing some things, and the idea that, well, lack of a state can do nothing, I think is clearly false. The more pertinent question, and unfortunately the much harder one to answer, is which one is optimal. And again, what is optimal? Good question. Um, if you're talking about the ability to defend yourself, to defend a society, um, I think decentralized systems have a lot to go for them. They have a lot to speak for them. I think that having martial ability within society is something that has a lot going for it. I think that in terms of offensive ability, I think that states are very useful. I think that having the ability to coerce people around you to do something that they're not really interested in is a very, it gives you more options than just assuming people will be into it. Although it happens, there are decentralized, stateless conquests that have happened throughout history, especially in prehistory. Um, and there's even, I mean, I could point out, more modern examples. We would have things like the conquistadors that I mentioned, but actually, in the United States, Americans, especially in the 19th century, had a bad habit, if you want to call it that, of invading as not as military, not as government actors, but as private citizens, basically going on an adventure, invading and taking over Latin American countries like Nicaragua, like Cuba, and kind of maybe the best example of this. A lot of these didn't pan out in the long run, but some of them did. And Texas is probably a really good example of that, at least partially. It's something that people don't really realize anymore, but there's entire books about how Americans would kind of be inspired by uh, the Society of Mars. Those of you who don't know, the first Punic War between Carthage and Rome was basically instigated when a bunch of Roman citizens decided they were going to go and become kingmakers, and they conquered uh, the uh, the the Principality of Syracuse on Sicily, and that led to a conflict with the Carthaginians, who also were trying to establish imperial control over Sicily, and that was the pretext that started the First Punic War. But basically, the Society of Mars were not Roman legionnaires. They were not part of the Roman state. They were just private Roman citizens. Like, fuck this place. We're gonna go like make our own empire. If you've ever seen the Michael Caine, Sean Connery movie, The Man That Would Be King, it's about two British officers who basically crossed the Hindu Kush into Afghanistan in the 1850s and attempt to set up their own state there by bringing 50 rifles and a whole bunch of ammunition on the idea that, well, they'll train some of the locals and create a military unit that can't be defeated. Americans used to do that in the 19th century. So, there is actually offensive capability that can happen from decentralized organizations. Is it better? Does it produce? I'm not. Is it even good to call a conquest something better? Yeah, that's a very open question. But just say the history is very, very complicated. There's a lot of points either way, but it does demolish, I think, the reflexive starting point that most people begin with, which is just to assume the system that they have, whatever that be, is automatically the only one that can work. That's obviously false. Obviously false. The more pertinent question: which one works better? Which one, and what ends and values are perpetuated by each system? That's the more important question, and it's the harder question. And books like this can help clarify that to a point. I mean, we're talking about clarifying a tiny sliver of a problem, of an issue. I don't want to even say it's a problem, but of a topic that is very vast. So anyway, I thought it was an interesting book, fairly short read. Um, I learned a lot about the history of Switzerland. I had When I was in ninth grade, I read The Conquest of Gaul, and one of the first chapters in that, Caesar talks about the first Celts that he encountered and fought with, and they were the Helvetii, who he describes as basically a tribe of immigrants that had to flee their homeland, presumably in Switzerland. When I was in college, in German class, I learned that the internet abbreviation at the end of Swiss, web addresses is CH. Everyone assumed it was SW. No, it's CH for Cantons of Helvetica. I didn't put two and two together until I read this book, Cantons of Helvetica. Helvetica is a reference to the Helvetii from Caesar's conquest of Gaul. So I learned that from the book as well. And each revelation was separated by about 10 years, which I thought that was kind of cool. So yeah, good book. Talks about Swiss independence from the Austrians and William Tell and shooting the apple. Supposedly a Austrian nobleman by the name of Gessler. Um, had William Tell threatened, basically told him to shoot an apple off his son's head. And William Tell said, if I miss, the next arrow won't, and it'll be in your head or whatever. And this is kind of like the apocryphal beginning of Swiss marksmanship. So anyway, it was a good book. I recommend it for anyone who's curious about this topic. If you ever studied World War II and you always look at the map and there's this white neutral space in the middle of Europe, that hasn't, for some reason, was never conquered by the Nazis. And you ever wondered why? The more kind of common today left-wing approach is to say, oh, they were just Nazi appeasers, taking the money from the Jews that were killed and putting it in their banks, and uh, not that that didn't happen, but that's a ridiculously unfair um, summation of Switzerland's role in World War II. Both the British and the U.S. government were very grateful that Swiss had such effective armed neutrality. Alan Dulles, who was stationed there for a long time during the war, operating the OSS, said so. Churchill said that of all the neutrals, Switzerland was by far the greatest and deserved the most. They did not kowtow to the Nazis. The Nazis many times made demands along the lines of allowing troops to pass through their countries, something that the Swiss absolutely forbid and were categorical in not allowing, which cannot be said for countries like Sweden, which allowed German divisions to pass through their territory to aid in Operation Barbarossa. Um, or Spain, which allowed the German Navy access to some of their ports and German military personnel to be active in their country. But yeah, interesting book. A relatively unknown piece of history since there are no battles that took place there. There was no actual campaigns, and so it kind of gets ignored. It would have been one of those big what ifs. What would have happened if the Germans invaded? I think it depends when and what circumstances. I think it would have been very interesting, and I think it would have been, however, the outcome, an insane bloodbath, which is something the Germans apparently believed. And apart from the fact that they said so in many of their reports, their actions, I think, say much louder than anything they said in any of their studies. So, anyway, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.